drawn again to these opening words from the reading. Wisdom traditions worldwide say there is no greater blessing than to live the life of your soul, the source of your deepest personal fulfillment. And then a conjunction, and your greatest service to others. I think we live in a world where a lot of people are interested in their personal fulfillment, their personal happiness. But I don't hear a lot about greatest service to others. I mean, where has that gone, really? Where's that notion, even of leadership, gone? Where's that gone, of leadership that serves people as best they can, the whole? Even the notion of a king, which I know, we're Americans, we're not supposed to like kings. But the archetype is rooted in sacrifice. Sacrificing one's personal fulfillment for the whole. So there's some combination on the soul level of what is mine to do, and maybe a more contemporary way of saying is, who am I, combined with, and who am I here to serve? How can I give this self away, in a way? Where has that gone? I don't know what I'm going to talk about this morning, to tell you the truth. I know I had a week to sort of work on it, or longer, It happens sometimes. It happens because one of the things I feel responsible in doing is facilitating a conversation about what are the most pressing issues and questions of our age. Why else gather together? What else are we going to do except gather together and talk about what is going on right in front of us? What can any of us do about it? Can we serve in whatever way we can? Or is it time to hunker down and circle the wagons and sort of protect ourselves? Yeah. So, in that sense, I don't really know what I'm going to talk about. I was set to talk about all kinds of really awesome things. But that's what happens when we live in a world which is a mixed blessing and curse, I suppose, where what goes on in a high school in Florida is on our phones in a matter of seconds. And we have to wake up to, what is this place? Who are we? Why is this happening? To whom is it happening? Is there anything that we can do about it? And now all the things that I've been hovering around, really from Ken Wilber for like 7 months since I took this role. He says we live in an age of nihilism or narcissism. Do you remember me saying that? Okay. I'm going to keep saying it because it's true. We live in an age of nihilism and narcissism. Narcissism is, I'm going to get all I can, well I can, and the number one person to look out for is me. And maybe if I'm super enlightened, my immediate family. And it seems to be the case that our pop idols, including those in the White House, because it's very mixed now, this sort of pop culture we live in, very much promotes a kind of narcissism. And we also live on the other end of the spectrum, which is, what the hell can any of us do about this? And that's the nihilism. And I don't know what it was like when you first heard once again about a school shooting. I certainly felt, what can any of us do about this? Posting things on Facebook doesn't seem like enough. So, is there some alternative way of being in the world that wants to emerge? I also started thinking about the Bible. I know. I don't want to scare anybody away. Um, but a couple things have struck me recently, and it's a kind of like an irony sitting in the middle of the Christian America, which I know isn't really a real thing, but it's sort of the myth we tell ourselves. I love the phrase Judeo-Christian. Like, we live in a Judeo-Christian, as if Jews and Christians got along. Like, oh yeah, we just got together and we created this Judeo-Christian place. Yeah, right. Anyway, sitting right smack in the middle of that story, the story that we tell ourselves, is a lot of irony, because you have a lot of people in America that think they ought to be following the Bible, but apparently haven't read it, because, first of all, one of the major themes in the entire biblical narrative is absolutely crushing kings who take advantage of the poor, the widow, the alien, and the orphan. It's the entire canon of the prophets. That's all they do, is scream at leaders who take advantage of the poor, the alien, the widow, and the orphan. In other words, the most vulnerable in society. And apparently, they've also never read what Jesus has to say about people who cause little children to suffer. It's better for them to have a giant stone tied around their neck and be thrown into the sea. Except we don't mean our politicians who make decisions that cause little ones to suffer. Not them. We can't hold them responsible. And I was thinking about lament, a very old-fashioned word that is deeper than grief. It's grief. I think right now we live in a time where we must learn to grieve and lament not only the loss of life, that's worth crying over, but also lament the fact that many of our choices have led us here. That's what lament was supposed to be in the ancient world. Do you ever, this, by the way, is from the Bible, but also it's trans-biblical, if there's such a thing. All ancient cultures did this. During seasons of lament, they sat on the ground, they tore their clothes, and they threw dust on their heads. You know why? Because they were saying, where have we gone wrong? Not, who can we blame? When all we do is blame, and I like blaming people, especially our leader with the weird hair, okay? But if that's all we do, that's not a lament, and we learn nothing. That's called scapegoating. We do the very thing that he does to everybody else, which is, who can I blame? I'm going to blame the FBI. I'm going to blame the liberals. I'm going to blame Hillary Clinton, whatever. What do we do in turn? What do I do? I'll blame him. And we don't seem to get anywhere. Lament was a chance to say, where have we gone wrong? And I'm sorry, we live in America where not all of us are going to look the same, think the same, or act the same. So we have to say something like, where have we gone wrong? Not just, where have you gone wrong? It's hard. It's really hard. I'll give you one more old-fashioned word. Actually, I'm full of old-fashioned words. I'm going to use more of them in a minute. One that I really hate, like it gives me the willies because I grew up in fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, and that is the word repent. I mean, all I was ever told was that I needed to repent, all right? I'm just a freaking kid, But you know what it means? To turn around. That's all it means. Or if you like the Greek version, it means to change out your mind. Would you not agree that we need a change of mind? Would you not agree that it's time to turn around and go in a different direction? Oh my God, yes. And I think there's a relationship between lament, grief, and the seeds that get planted for some other way of doing this thing called life in America. They're related. So I don't want to get ahead of it. It's a season of lament, but somewhere I think in that heartbreak and in the ashes, we have to start saying, how are we going to live differently? At least that seems to be the case. Some sort of invitation is at hand. And I was also thinking about nihilism and narcissism that dominate our culture. And what do they both have in common? They have a lack of connection, both of them. So narcissism is a lack of integration, intimacy, and connection with other people or other things. It's about a kind of self-obsession. A narcissist, it can't have an intimate relationship. They might go from person to person to person, to wife to wife to wife, to husband to husband to husband, to whatever, fill in the blank. But also probably with everything else in their orbit. Plants and animals and trees and frogs. It's a lack of connection. Nihilism also seems to have a similar quality to it. All of this is meaningless. I can't do anything about this. Might as well check out, which is a lack of connection. And somewhere, I think, we have to admit and acknowledge that we live in a culture like this. And a question like diversity, which is what we're supposed to be talking about, is a question of connection. Not just like, can we have like more people from a different ethnicity kind of hanging around, and we'll check diversity off the list, like, oh, I feel better about myself because I have a black friend or something like that. I'm talking about diversity in a much richer sense, which is about connection. That's what Mark Keith was saying a couple weeks ago with the 13th person at the table, not only just being at the table, but being able to dine at the table. That's intimacy. That's sharing a meal together. Now, I'm thinking about that literally and also symbolically. So we live in a world full of closed systems. And how are we going to live from a new place of courage and openness and the ability to say, I might be wrong, and something about the world that we have constructed is harming people and hurting people. One of the things I've noticed in the news is that very quickly people look for some kind of category in which to put this tragedy, what happened in Florida. This 28. And maybe it's something of just about the way the egoic mind works. If we can find a category to put it in, then we can get a handle on it. So some people go the mental health route. They're like, this is a mental health issue. And as soon as it's a mental health issue, you're like, okay, that's what it's about. Or some people go the gun route. This is a gun issue. And as soon as it's that, it's, okay, I feel better about, at least I know what the issue is. The problem is, it's all of the above. It is a mental health issue. It is a gun issue. It is a political issue. It is a personal issue. It's an education issue. That's the kind of world we live in. We cannot divide it up. That was my main point last week, talking about holons, where atoms are inside of cells, and cells are inside of molecules, and molecules are inside of complex organisms, and it's about transcending and including. You cannot separate the world out. So we have to say, how bad is the problem? It involves all of the above. That's how bad the problem is. I don't know if you saw that research out recently that in 2012, they have now charted a dramatic spike in teenage suicide, depression, and anxiety that they think is related to the ubiquitous use of cell phones. Now, who's going to hold Apple responsible? Well, I kind of like my Apple product. They're neutral. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a complex world we live in. So I'll give you some Heschel. He says, not everyone is guilty, but all are responsible. Not everyone is guilty, but all are responsible. He says that's the beginning of a just society. People who say, all right, I'm not guilty of fill in the blank, but am I responsible? Yeah, I think so. So that means we live in a culture where we have to increase our responsibility. Holding people responsible, organizations responsible, governments responsible, politicians responsible, educators responsible, even the wonderful companies that create all these technologies that are just neutral. Do they not bear some responsibility? Are they guilty? Are they guilty of causing depression and anxiety in our young people, creating a very dark world where they feel like they have no other choice than to either end their life or end someone else's life? Not all are guilty, but all are responsible. It's so much easier to just find blame the NRA. If it was only that simple. Do they bear some responsibility? You better believe it. Are they guilty? Well, that's a different question. No. Yeah. I'm looking at my notes to see if there's anything on here that I wanted to say or planned on saying. I was thinking about this kid's life who committed these terrible murders. And he was 19 years old. And if you were to draw a line, like a trajectory of his life, and from the moment he was a toddler, an infant, to where he is now, how many millions of inputs would there be? How many millions of possible other directions could this person have gone? It's kind of scary to think about. How many influences could have come into his life that would change forever the trajectory of his life? How many? I don't know. It's to be grieved. God, how do we end up in this world? You think about also these kids who lost their life. Get up one day, go to school, do what they're supposed to do, what the adults tell us to do, which is go to frickin' school again. That we created and force them by law to go to, but then can't really protect them. Talk about some cognitive dissonance. Talk about some mistrust on a deep, deep level. I do have a little bit of hope that young people, and I don't include myself in that figure anymore. Maybe some of you would disagree. I hope so. Are going to say, we don't want to live in the world that our parents created. We don't want to live in that world. We're going to do some courageous things that they were unwilling to do. We're going to take responsibility for things that they refuse to take responsibility for. I hope so. I hope that's the case. So I want to, in the last few minutes here, share with you what I was going to talk a bit about today. And they're really old-fashioned words here. And they're words that we talked a little bit about in the pre-session, before the session. And they're the words of fate and destiny. Fate and destiny. And I'd like to use them right now in a more ancient and mythic way. Fate, in the Greek world, was about limits. Limits. That we are all born, every single person in the world is born with limits. How do you know? You can't fly, right? You can't breathe underwater. You have limits. You can be anything you want except a lot of things. Yeah. That was the Greek way of saying everybody has limits. Everybody. And we have limits. You have limits. And they talked about that also in terms of culture. Culture has limits. One of them is that it's run by human beings. That's a really severe limit. Because we're limited. We're limited human beings. But we don't like to accept limits. We tell kids they can be anything they want. Which is, of course, another word for that is a lie. They have choices. Greeks like to talk about choice. But there are limits. And there are two sides of those limits. Some of the things are things that you can't do anything about. You can't do anything about the fact that you were born to two other human beings called your parents. You had no say in that. Nobody consulted you. That's a limit. You can't swap them out. I know. It's a limit. And your ethnicity is a limit. And now you can start going, oh yeah, actually there are plenty of limits in my life. Yep. You know another big limit? You're going to die. Yeah, it's a limit. Yep. You can be anything you want, except you're still going to be someone who's going to die. Sorry. I found that kind of funny. Okay. But this is what the Greeks also say about limits. Some of the limits, like societal limits, you can do something about. Like we live in a culture where there's some limits we can't do anything about, and there's some that we can't. The gun culture we live in, here's a limit. We live right now in a country where there are hundreds of thousands of guns. We live in a country right now, listen to this, where there are every single year, 12 billion bullets are sold. 12 billion. Now, if you feel like I have the right to protect myself, well, yeah, from every single person on the planet. 12 billion. That's a lot. Seems like a lot. The question is, are there any limits to such a number? Because that's the strange dynamic. There are some things that it doesn't appear this exists, which also raises the question of, and where do we want the limits of our own society? Where do we want this to end? I was thinking about Israel this week. And a lot of people, even people on the right, they love Israel, Israel, weapons, soldiers. This is a country that puts into the hands of 18-year-old girls and boys fully automatic weapons. You can go to Israel, you meet a 18-year-old kid there, man or woman, they know how to fire and use a fully automatic weapon. And some of them have had to use it. And when they get out of the military and they want a gun, they have to apply like everybody else. They have to go through a psych evaluation. They have to renew their application every single year. And if they qualify for a gun, they are given 9 bullets for life. So here's a culture that says, we are surrounded by our enemies. We feel like we want the right to protect ourselves, but we're not idiots. Now that's a limit. The society decided. Who decided that? God? You can't blame God at this point. The culture got together and said, what are we going to do? Given the limits of where we live and the limits of being a human being, and we're going to try to make some difficult, reasonable choices that aren't going to please everybody. So that means at a drunken party, you're like, oh, I'm firing off my one bullet. Now you're down to 8. All right? Dang it. And you can't go to the store and get more. That's a limit that the society sets. There are some limits of fate you can do something about and some you can't. Now, what does it have to do with destiny? Here's what the Greeks said. The pressure of the limits. The pressure. The cauldron that you're cooking in creates the capacity to discover destiny. The difficulties, let me translate it this way. The difficulties of the culture and society that you live in, with all of its limits, fate, is supposed to stir your soul so that you can live the biggest vision you can for yourself and for everyone else. Let me reread this passage from Bill Plotkin. Wisdom traditions worldwide say there's no greater blessing than to live the life of your soul, the source of your deepest personal fulfillment and your greatest service to others. I'm saying that as dark as our culture is right now, which I think it is, it's also a pressure cooker. And I think we have a responsibility to not only sort of look within, what can I do? What is the biggest vision I can have for my life? But also start telling other people, calling them to this higher vision. A vision that isn't so narcissistic or nihilistic. And it might have to sound old-fashioned like, how can you serve your world? How can you create a culture and a society and a school system where your kids and their kids and their kids can live a healthy, whole, life-giving, cooperative, generous, diverse life? That requires tremendous vision. It does. In some ways, I think I'm asking, do you believe in the human soul? And the old notion of that is that you have a unique place that only you can inhabit in the world. And the other thing that goes along right with that is that every single person has a unique place that only they can inhabit in the world. But you need a certain amount of health, safety, fate, a container in which to discover that. Which means, I guess, we have some work to do. All right, let's listen to Roosevelt. Do what you can with what you have, where you are. It's the where you are bit that is more like the soul. You inhabit this place. We inhabit this corner of West Michigan. Is there anything we can do? Do what you can with what you have, where you are. I'd like to believe that every person here has something hidden that only they can bring forth. It's a belief I have. And I'm looking out at many of you. Some of you are a little bit older than me, which is one of the reasons why I like to come here. And I think perhaps we need an older generation more than ever, because they have a kind of vision for life. On the one hand, yours is coming to a close. In some way, so was mine. But a question like, do what you can with what you have where you are, you're seeing your own limits in a way that a 16-year-old doesn't. So in some senses, I'm asking, what responsibility do you have with this ticking clock to turn your attention toward our young people and inspire them to live their own inner capacities here, their own inner soul depths, and to create a world that's worth inhabiting? I don't know. Where's my David White thing? To be human is to become visible. To be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. And here's what I'd like to believe more than anything else. You are not a troubled guest on this earth. You are not an accident amidst other accidents. You were invited from another and greater night than the one from which you just emerged. So, I guess I just want to end by saying, I want to be a participant with all of you in the most pressing kind of conversations we can have around, let's do what we can with what we have where we are. That's it.